The neighborhood was one of those upscale areas, not unlike those that are out from downtown Jacksonville. This particular neighborhood had houses that were larger than normal, had a lot of exquisite lawns, and it was the kind of neighborhood where everyone would leave and go to places like Paris and Rome for Christmas. And there was a particular cat burglar who knew that about this neighborhood, and so he planned on going in the middle of the night into this neighborhood and discovered that a whole range of houses were empty, except there was a lot to get. So he was quietly making his way house to house. He was in this particular house and was really making a go of it, filling things into his bag. It was totally quiet. He thought, this is just too easy. He heard from the back dark corner of this house a voice then that said, "Jesus sees you." He was stunned. He stopped, put his bag down, was quiet for a moment, just thought it was a figment of his imagination, may have just heard this voice, and began to put more loot in the bag. Then he heard from the dark corner again, "Jesus is coming for you." He was stunned again. He went towards the voice, though, this time to the back dark corner, and he saw a bird cage in that corner. And he went over to the bird cage, and he saw two parrots inside. He said to one parrot, "Are you the one who was talking about Jesus?" The parrot said, "Yes." He said to the parrots, "What are your names?" And the other parrot said, "Our names are Mary and Joseph." The cat burglar then asked the parrots, "What kind of fool would name parrots Mary and Joseph?" The other parrot then responded, "The same fool that named the Rottweiler Jesus." I thought you might need some Christmas humor on this fourth Advent. Well, this is a Sunday where we talk about Mary and Joseph. They're just not parrots. And about the birth of Jesus, but he's not a Rottweiler. In our modern age, we have heard some astounding announcements, life-altering, life-changing announcements. Some of you remember the announcement, Pearl Harbor has been bombed. Others of you know also, either through the newspaper or the radio, VE Day. And then a few months later, VJ Day. Celebrations on the street. Or in our own era, we heard announcements like, "Man walks on moon." Martin Luther King Jr. has been assassinated. Or on a happier note, "It's a boy," or "It's a girl." The New York Mets won the World Series, for heaven's sake. And then we've also heard announcements like the World Trade Center has been bombed, been struck. All of these announcements that you and I know of or we've heard in our own lifetime, all of them rolled together do not begin to touch the announcement that's in the gospel text this morning from Matthew chapter 1. When Joseph and Mary learn the news that they are to bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which means God is with us. There's no other announcement in world history that has been so life-altering and society-changing than that announcement. All of the others rolled together can't even touch this one. I hope that you were taking notice as Roger was reading, knowing that that is the announcement of the ages. And what is the good news of that announcement? It is simply, but most powerfully, this, that you and I are not left alone. The Christian theology of this text tells us we're not wound up as individual realities and then set loose and then that's it. No, this announcement tells us that we're not alone. The human beings are not alone, not just those who are baptized Christians. No one in the world is left to his or her own self-determination, self-sufficiency, self-aggrandizement. We're told in this announcement that God is with us every day, beginning in the pinnacle birth of Jesus at Bethlehem. There's only one snag that you and I have then with that great good news, and that is that we live in a society that tells us to live differently. We live in a culture that says you are to be able to manage your own life, to pull yourself up, to take hold, to be self-sufficient, self-reliant. It's caused huge issues, this living our life in solitary confinement. As of 2019, the average American, according to Pew's Action, which is like the Gallup poll these days, in 2019, we're told that the average American had 2 significant friends. 20 years ago, the same question was asked. Those same average Americans said that they had 4 significant friends. 20 years before that, the questions were asked, and the average American had 6 significant friends. You see the trend, don't you? It's a disturbing trend. It's one that tells us that 33% of the people of the population 20 years ago had significant community. This year, it was discovered 15% of American population has significant community. David Brooks has written recently in his commentary on a book by Robert Hall. Robert Hall wrote a book, This Land of Strangers. He writes, "The truth is, relationships are the most valuable and value-creating resource of any society. They are our lifelines to survive, grow, and thrive." He goes on to write, "However, there's a mountain of evidence suggesting that the quality of our relationships has been in steady decline for decades. In the 1980s, 20% of Americans said that they were severely lonely. Now, it's 50%. Wow. Along with that, of course, is the disturbing news that we are now having a 40-year high of suicide rate. Arthur Brooks also has weighed in. He's the head of the American Enterprise Institute. He wrote also recently, "America is suffering an epidemic of loneliness. According to a recent large-scale survey from the healthcare provider Cigna, most Americans suffer from strong feelings of loneliness and isolation, the lack of significance in their relationships. Nearly half of these feel chronically lonely." Well, how about you this Advent Christmas season? How about myself? How about the community of St. John's Cathedral? How are we doing in the face of this good news that's being announced to us and squaring it then with this difficult challenge that we have in society? When Valerie and I lived in New York City, we traveled on the number 6 train nearly every day. Number 6 train is one of the primary north-south trains on the east side of the city. One day I got on the 6 train to go into Midtown, and one of the interesting things on a subway is to notice the new advertisements, because if you were on the day before, it's the same thing. Then when a new one pops up, everybody kind of notices it. And there was a new one that morning, and it had emblazoned on the wall in that number 6 train, "You cannot go it alone in New York City." Sponsored by the Psychological Services of NYU. That got my attention. Got everybody's attention in the train. You can't go it alone in New York. You can't go it alone in Jacksonville. Doesn't work. You and I know that the pressure, the line, the cultural message to us that we ought to be able to handle our life by ourselves is a lie. And we know it over and over and over again. This is not anything new, however. Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1943 was in a cell, number 31 to be exact. It was a Gestapo prison called Tegel. He was writing to his fiancée, Maria von Wiedemeyer, a couple days before Christmas in 1943. And that note was smuggled out by a friendly guard, and later now we have it. This is what he wrote to Maria von Wiedemeyer from the cell, number 31. "As I sit in my cell this year, and I have before me a small green twig, which is my Christmas tree, and as I've received parcels of bread and dirty water for my meal today, I'm imagining that this is my communion. It's all I have this Christmas except to write you." He goes on to say, "But God is not ashamed of human need. He enters right into it. He chooses a human being to be his instrument and works his wonders where we least expect it. A manger in Bethlehem. Where else are we to seek God's presence for all of our betrayals, our weak faith, and our crushing loneliness?" It's in the Emmanuel of God, Bonhoeffer wrote, because human beings are built for communion. That's it, isn't it? That's what we celebrate during this week, that you and I are built for communion with the one who's born in Bethlehem. We yearn for it. We need it from each other, from this cathedral. When Moss Hart, the great playwright, was 10 years old, he lived with his parents and his siblings in an old tenement in the Bronx. And when he was 10, his father invited him a couple days before Christmas to go take a walk with him down to 149th Street on the west side, and to go to a place where in their Christmas they had shopping carts lining the street. Moss Hart reports that he was beside himself. He was so excited. He said, "I could hardly breathe. My father had never invited me to do anything like this." So it was just Moss Hart and his daddy. They walked a number of blocks down to 149th Street. They got to the shopping carts. Moss records in his memoirs, "We stopped and I said to my father with as much control as I could, 'Wow, look at that chemistry set.' They walked across the street to another cart. 'Wow, look at those toy soldiers.' Another one down the street. 'Those balloons,' he said with some control." They kept walking quietly through all the carts. What Moss realized when they came towards the end of all the carts is that his father could not afford anything that was in the carts. He just had a couple coins, but they were all more. Moss realized this. They got to the last cart, He said we turned quietly and began a slow stroll back to our old tenement in the Bronx. He said, I wanted to say to my father, the chemistry set doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I wanted to say to my father, I love you, but I couldn't. I didn't. Halfway home, Mark Moss Hart records that by accident, sort of, his little hand then slipped into his father's bigger hand. He said, that's the first time that my father had ever touched me. He held my hand, Moss Hart records. He held it as if I mattered. For the first time in my life, a father and a son then held hands for a few blocks. I finally looked up at him towards the end of the walk and said, you're the best. We were finally realizing that we needed each other. So much of the running over one another, the busyness of these weeks before Christmas, has to do with the human need for communion. I can imagine then that each of us sort of lives with concentric circles around us. The closest one, of course, would be our relationship with God. Could it be that this Advent, this Christmas season, that you and I would take some steps in that most inner circle? That we would strike ourselves out of the middle of our existence more often and invite the living God into the middle? Don't we know that our lives work better when we do that? When we take ourselves out of the middle and we ask the God of love and justice to stand in the middle, we know our lives work better. Could it be this season we would take a few steps in that direction? And then there's a second circle that we might say is the human community around us. And that would be the closest community that we know, that is those who are the most trustworthy, the ones we're closest with, family members or really good friends, children or grandparents, etc. Could it be that this Advent and this Christmas we would take a few steps into that circle and say, I'd like a couple of the relationships to be even deeper, even more rich. I'd like us to trust each other even more than we already do, to take a good marriage and make it greater, to make a good parenting relationship and make it better, to take that which is already close and good and ask God for the gift of a richer relationship. There's a third circle that orbits our existence, and that is people we don't know very well, but we would call them acquaintances. Maybe people here at St. John's. We see them across the way at the pew. Oh, I kind of know that person. I've seen him or her at the coffee hour. And we take it upon ourselves this Advent, not next Advent, this Advent and Christmas, to say, I'm going to take some steps in that circle. I'm going to branch out. I'm going to initiate, to say to someone, I'd like to know you better. Do you know how it feels to have someone say to you and to me, I'd like to know you better? There's a fourth circle around us. They would be what I might call benevolent strangers. We don't really know them. They're across the way, or they're across town, or they're up the street from where we live. We've seen them, but we would put them in the category of stranger. Could it be this Advent and Christmas that you and I would take some steps in that circle, that we would reach out in some way to say, I'd like to know who you are. I'd like to understand more of your neighborhood. This is a benevolent stranger, so we have all kinds of reasons to reach out and befriend them, to possibly bring them into the third circle, you see. Oh, and then there's a last circle. It's the most difficult circle. It's the circle where you and I would put titles on it like enemy. We say things like, those people, that person who did me damage, or I don't like them for some reason. They look different from me. They're across the political aisle from me. They grew up with different values from me. Possibly they have a different orientation from me, or a different skin pigment, or they may speak a different language. They may listen to different music or believe in a different God. Oh, could it be that Emmanuel, God with us, is inviting us to take some steps into that last circle this Advent and Christmas and say, I want to deepen. I want to have a larger understanding. I want you to broaden my conscience so that something matters this Christmas, that I've gone into that last difficult circle. And in fewer ways, I then say, those people over there, or that person. Rather, they begin to come closer in our circles of living. So the world holds its breath during the next couple days as Mary and Joseph ponder this incredible news, this announcement of the ages that's changed the world more than any other announcement ever. You will bear a son, and you shall call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Could it be with Joseph and Mary that you and I would find ourselves anew saying, yes, yes, may it be so according to your word. Amen.